Online?
Hola,
Good
Stephany.
morning, good afternoon, everybody. We are starting now this webinar in which we are launching or discussing the recently launched book, Finance, Growth and Democracy, Connections and Challenges in Europe and Latin America in the Era of Permacrisis. This book is a result of a research that was conducted in the context of a Jean Monnet network, which was called Crisis, Equity, Democracy for Europe and Latin America, in which most of the authors and editors were participants. Today we'll have for this launching two guest speakers who will be presented briefly, but Stephany Griffith-Jones and Loukas Tsoukalis. We'll have the three co-editors organizing the webinar, which is Dimitris Katsikas, Antonieta Lins, and myself. And we have some of the authors who will be able also to participate in the discussions. And we have, of course, we are being sent online to the YouTube, and the audience there can also send questions in the chat, and they will be transmitted to us. So welcome again, and I hand over to Maria Antonieta Lins.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us. It's our pleasure to start this webinar in which we're going to present this book, Finance, Growth and Democracy, Connections and Challenges in Europe and Latin America in the era of permacrisis. It was a very interesting project, and we are very honored to have here to comment the whole book or aspects of it, Stephany Griffith-Jones, who is now who doesn't need introductions, of course. She's an economist. She's now the vice governor of the Central Bank of Chile. And Professor Loukas Tsoukalis, also an economist, who from Greece, but also in Paris, and also having studied everywhere in the world. So we first, before we talk, I would like to hand the floor to Dimitris Katsikas to explain the whole idea of the project, and then we go to the speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tuka. Good afternoon and good morning, as we have many people from many different countries and continents. I'm very happy that we're able to organize this online book launch, which, as Andrea said, it was the result of a 3-year research program funded by the European Union. It was 3 years of very interesting and productive work, cooperation with colleagues from very different countries. It was a very exciting and fulfilling experience, and during that time, I discovered not only new colleagues with similar interests, but also made some very good friends during the process. I'd like to thank Andrea, first of all, for because she and her university, PUC-Rio, were the coordinators of the research project, and did a fantastic job. And of course, he's one of the co-editors along with Tuka and myself. Thank them both for their contribution to the volume, and of course all the authors. Some of them are here today with us online, others are watching via the YouTube channel. This book has 20 chapters, very interesting chapters with covering a diverse array of topics, all related to this core concept of permacrisis, i.e. Dealing with the challenges emanating from multiple interconnected crises during the past roughly 15 to 20 years. And of course, last but not least, I would like also, on my behalf, to also thank the two very honored guest speakers. Thank you very much for being here today. And also, by the way, they both participated in the previous version of this project. This latest project was a renewal of an early project with both Loukas Tsoukalis and Stephany participated as well. I think this book is a very timely one, and I think it has become even more so in recent months. And this is because, as we described in the introduction of the book, permacrisis is not simply the accidental occurrence of multiple crises during a period of time. It is the result often directly linked to major structural shifts in the world, both on the political and economic realm. And in terms of what we have been witnessing in the past few months and weeks, I think one major aspect, one major shift, such shift which is particularly relevant, is the shift in the balance of power among the major players in the world. Mainly due, but not only, to the emergence of China. Of course, the China shock did not happen during President Trump's presidency, this one or the first one. It happened before that, but itself was part, if you like, of a broader shift we would generally call globalization. And a careful examination, if you like, of the socioeconomic implications of these shifts would really reveal early on that we were bound to have leaders like President Trump emerging in the West. In many parts of our book, it is discussed how these multiple crises generally favor populist leaders and the rise of extreme voices. We have seen this in the EU, we have seen this in Latin America. We have now also a president where I think there is overwhelming consensus in the literature and the academia that is a type of populist politician. For the EU in particular, this is a great challenge because during this era of permacrisis, the EU, although it is a very successful, centralized, strong regional integration organization, in contrast, and we discussed this again in the introduction in the book, this is a common theme that emerges from the book, in contrast to Latin American regional organizations, there the situation is a dispersion, we have fragmentation of regional initiatives. Despite that, the European integration process is still an ongoing and incomplete process. The EU is not a state. Has to consolidate, merge, and compromise very different interests, national interests, and worldviews, and occasionally has failed to do so efficiently, particularly in the area of foreign policy. I think it's particularly vulnerable in that aspect. And you know, the inability of the EU to address successfully this crisis not only worsens their impact for the average citizen or societies at large, but also, again, picking up the same thread of argumentation, strengthens the voice of populists and extremists, including the far right. We see what's happening in Germany, for example. And in the case of European integration, these populists also typically are also Eurosceptics as well, and thereby the progress of European integration achieved today is under threat. On the positive side, as we discuss in the book, of course, in the EU in particular, we have also had successes. The way the EU handled the pandemic was surprisingly perhaps effective and efficient, and therefore showed that the EU can deliver solutions for big crises that nation states alone cannot for their citizens. Things are, of course, more complicated in Latin America. Latin America has a long history of democratic crisis, and as again it is shown in the book, the interaction, if you like, of weak regional integration institutions and unstable democracies has often produced crisis, or now in this era of permacrisis is producing new types of risks for democratic stability or macroeconomic stability. All this, of course, are linked and connected to a common thread that is at the heart of our project, which is finance and the role of finance. Finance is very important both for economic stability, economic growth, but also democratic stability. And we address it in the book, both different aspects of finance, but also we have a separate section on new developments which are, both offer new solutions, but pose new dangers as well. Cryptocurrencies and fintech is a separate section of our book, and I think it's very interesting to see what happens in the future in this area. Now, I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm particularly interested in hearing what our guest speakers have to say about this balance between successes and failures of regional integration organizations to address this crisis, particularly in this new international environment that's developing. With this geoeconomic antagonisms and competition between US and China. EU is in the middle. Latin America tries to be neutral. So it's very interesting to hear how these regions are going to cope, not only with regional with multiple crises anymore, but also with an increasingly different international geoeconomic and political environment. Thank you very much. I think now,
thank you.
Stephany, yeah.
Dimitris, now I would like to hand the floor to Stephany.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joining this group again, where I enjoyed participating very much and commenting on this really important and excellent book about the link between finance, growth, and democracy, which is, I think, it's unusual to link these issues, and I think it's a very crucial and important link. One of the first things I would like to mention, thinking about this topic, is that there is a different situation between the past, because in the recent past, say starting in the 1980s, we had mainly financial crises, which became, actually, they were so frequent that some people were talking that financial crises were the new normal since the 1980s. We started with the Latin American debt crisis. We had then the tequila crisis starting in Mexico, but also the East Asian crisis, the most successful economies, which spread to Russia and briefly actually to the US, though it didn't become a big crisis. And then we had the so-called global financial crisis in 2008-9, which is actually was really more a North Atlantic crisis. And these were crises that basically originated in the behavior of the financial sector and or in macroeconomic disequilibria, but they affected the rest of the economy and the society. For example, the debt crisis of the 1980s led to the lost decade of development in Latin America. The so-called global financial crisis of 2008-9, I think, as the book actually writes correctly, undermined, I think, faith in the globalized market economy, and it contributed, as the book says, to increased polarization, the rise of populism, and so on. Something changed in the perception of a successful market, global economy. But the more recent crises have had origins not so much in the financial sector, except in 2023, where we had the crisis linked to Silicon Valley Bank in the US, but this was successfully handled by the Fed and the US Treasury. But the more recent crises, like COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, had important macroeconomic effects, including on significantly increased inflation, on which I've been dealing with in the Central Bank of Chile, and also in a fall, particularly COVID, in the form of fall of economic activity. And then we have the very recent major changes in the global commercial policy, which originated in the US, but with reactions from major trading partners, which will also have major impacts, starting in the short term, again with effects on inflation and economic activity, but may also alter the overall trade and possibly the broader global management architecture, financial and trade. And as a policymaker, sort of working, if you like, in the coal face of policymaking, an ex-academic, one of the things that I've realized, that I've learned, is that these major changes have an important impact on sharply increasing uncertainty, which makes policymaking much more difficult, as it's very hard to predict or project future economic trends. And this is difficult in normal times because we have, of course, asymmetric information. We don't know what the future will hold. But if you have these very major changes, it's much more difficult to understand, and therefore it's much harder to take correct policy decisions. Very difficult for policymakers to take correct decisions about the future, because one is, for example, central banks project inflation, project economic activity. But if everything is changing or is in crisis, then you don't know what will happen in the coming months. And the other problem, I think, from the point of view of government authorities, is that these frequent changes or crises, we also saw it in the debt crisis of the 1980s in Latin America, means that you focus almost exclusively on short-term economic management, reacting to changes, and you lose focus, even though you don't want to, on medium-term challenges, like we have this main challenge, I think, which is mitigating and adapting to climate change, or more broadly, having more inclusive development. But this is not just an issue for policymakers. Uncertainty is equally or more damaging for private sector actors, because uncertainty encourages investors, for example, and this is in the literature, but we can see it in reality, to postpone or reduce investment, because they have the option of waiting. So you don't know what will happen with trade policy. You don't know whether to invest more in the US or in China or in Latin America. So you just wait. By waiting, you reduce investment, you postpone growth, and you postpone development. It can also discourage households to consume, as recent surveys have shown. People are consumers, households are very uncertain. And this may undermine growth, employment, lower investment and consumption. And this lowering of investment may be particularly crucial, not just for future growth and employment in general, but particularly for the green economy, particularly for the transition to the green economy, which, as the book points out, and as we've seen in previous books of this group, requires massive investment, both public and private. And this future lower growth may lead to lower welfare, which may react to weaken democracy because it will lower the welfare of the population and could contribute to the rise of populist or extremist solutions. But I want to also say that in these permacrises, and I want to illustrate with the climate change crisis, there are also great opportunities. And we have to, I think, look at the opportunities together with the challenges. And I think that there are, for example, challenges in the green transition, particularly for Latin American countries, like the financial and technological barriers for increasing green investment, and the vulnerability of Latin American countries to climate change and to all countries. But there are also great opportunities which arise through innovative green financing solutions, but also crucially by production as well as exports in commodities and sectors related to low carbon technologies, which require major supplies of different commodities. I want to illustrate a bit with the case of Chile, because that's the one I know better, but this is also true of many Latin American countries, because Chile and other Latin American countries are suppliers of commodities that are absolutely key for the green transition, like copper, lithium, and huge potential for green hydrogen. And so these countries actually enjoy a privileged position. This is the new oil, the resources for renewable energy. Due to we have a sort of resource blessing. Economists like to talk about the resource curse of commodities, but I think we have a resource blessing of these commodities that are crucial for the green transition, as the rest of the world and Latin America, but particularly the European Union, Asia, and until recently the United States, accelerate the green transition. And therefore, these Latin American countries attract both external and domestic investment and have major new export opportunities, which can lead to higher economic growth. And in the short term, but also, I think, medium increase in the growth prospects in the medium term. And so we held at the central bank with the Bank for International Settlements a Green Swan conference, and we were very privileged to have Nick Stern and Mark Carney, now who's been promoted to Prime Minister of his country. And what they highlighted is that clean energy is already cheaper in many regions of the world than the one produced from burning fossil fuels. So there is a sort of Schumpeterian growth story embedded in the switch to a new energy generation matrix, where the decline in the price of electricity could be translated into productivity gains and thus higher economic growth. Secondly, as I was saying, Latin American countries that are producers of commodities key for the green transition, like copper and lithium, like rare earth, and which have large potential for green hydrogen, will be able to supply the increasing demand of these raw or ideally processed materials for the rest of the world, especially the European economies that are very highly demanding, but also of these resources, as well as the US and China. Again, this would also imply productivity gains, increased exports, and probably higher growth for these lucky countries, which not only often have these resources in abundance, but can extract them at low cost. Just to give an example, if you extract lithium in Chile, because you don't have to dig or you don't have to break up the rock, but it's actually on the surface, it is much cheaper to do that. In the case of lithium in Chile, in the so-called salares. Another interesting point is that given the new trade and environmental regulations, such as the cross-border adjustment mechanism of the EU, this might help countries with a cleaner energy matrix and the ability to vertically integrate the production of minerals, reduce emissions to develop a competitive advantage. For example, there's an interesting paper by Mico and Valverde, which estimates that with a carbon price of $100 or 100 euros per ton of CO2, this would reduce the cash cost gap of processing copper between Chile and China significantly. So there will be no difference in cost if we take account of these carbon externalities. And the same would be the case of lithium. And this is because the energy matrix in countries like Chile, but also many others in LATAM, is much greener, much more low carbon than in the case of China, which, although it's made major investments in green energy, relies still to a very high proportion on coal and oil. And in this case, it's quite interesting that, for example, the share of renewable energy in the total electricity generation matrix in Chile has increased from 34% in 2012 to 63% in 2023. So the majority of electricity generation is green, low carbon. And this is also impressive in many other Latin American countries. But of course, this decarbonization process has been possible both due to public, but mainly a private investment, in which foreign investors, including the European Union investors, have played a very important role. And so this is actually interesting, because Chile, for example, has in the pipeline $50 billion for approval by the energy authority, by the environmental authorities, of just for green hydrogen. And so I think close collaboration and increasingly close collaboration between LATAM and EU countries to help finance such investment, both, as I said, through public flows, for example, multilateral banks like the European Investment Bank, and private flows, is going to be especially valuable and beneficial for both the EU and Latin American countries, as well as for mitigating climate change by lowering carbon emissions. So, as economists like to say, it could be a win-win-win. And there are examples of the role that these multilateral banks are already playing. For example, in Chile, there is a $1 billion facility run by the development bank Corfo, funded by the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, KfW. And so this is very, very valuable for stimulating a much higher private investment in green hydrogen. And as we know, financing needs for the green transition are very, very high. A lot is being done, but most of it is concentrated still in the advanced economies and in China, and with investment well below what is needed for emerging markets and Latin American countries, both to meet their climate goals and to contribute to the green transition globally. I think there's also a role, and again, Latin America can learn in this from Europe. There's a role for example, financial regulation. The European Union and the European Central Bank specifically has introduced regulations which oblige all the banks in the Eurozone to include climate risk and even environmental risk, biodiversity risk, in their assessment of all their credits. And it's gone so far that it is said that those banks that don't do it properly, most of them have, they will get fined. So there is a very clear regulatory development in the Eurozone and by the European Central Bank to try and channel private credit, private banking credit, to green activities, to low carbon activities. And I think this is, for example, a very valuable lesson that Latin America can learn, and where there's space for concrete collaboration between the EU and Latin American countries. And just to finish, I think that in these and other areas, enhanced cooperation between the European Union and Latin American countries is crucial. I think it's very encouraging that the recent agreement has been reached finally between the EU and Mercosur, for example. Chile has also had an upgraded agreement with the European Union. And this is, of course, particularly valuable in times when the international trade system is under such stress, and when it's necessary for countries both in Europe and in Latin America to diversify their trade from their existing channels. And as I said, I think it's particularly valuable to have collaboration between the EU and Latin America, because Latin America countries can learn from the rich experience and the strength of European integration and their good economic management in certain fields, and how the EU overcomes and often develops more as a response to crisis. Like it has issued these Eurobonds in response to the COVID crisis, and now it's modifying its fiscal rules, especially in Germany, to allow for greater investment in defense and infrastructure. And as the book points out very clearly, these institutions of the EU, like the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, and many others, are a major strength of the European Union, which contrasts with the weak Latin American process, which is fragmented and weak. and doesn't contribute to Latin American development. But I want to emphasize, also looking at the glass half full, that Latin America does have some important strength, such as the availability of these commodities, this new blessing, but also it's a continent, and I think this is not often said, where there are no wars, either in Latin America itself or in the neighborhood. So there are problems, of course, of violence, of criminality, or drugs, but there are no conflicts between countries, as we see with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is on the borders of Europe, as we saw with the case of Yugoslavia. I mean, in some ways, Latin America is much more a peaceful continent. And this relative peace, I think, is an advantage over EU, which has, suffered from the impact of these wars. And just to really finish, the book rightly emphasized that that these major shocks, like the energy crisis, have been felt more intensely in Europe. But luckily, I think the EU, and Loukas will tell us more about this, has the institutions and the common beliefs and the historical strength to help it overcome such major crises, though also having major challenges, as the book so insightfully analyzes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephany, very much for your brilliant insights. I would like to invite Loukas Tsoukalis to take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join this group again after a few years. First of all, congratulations, warmest congratulations on your book and all the best. I mean, you talk about finance, growth, and democracy in times of permacrisis. You can call it whatever you like, permacrisis, polycrisis, a series of never-ending crises. I propose to look at it in a slightly different way. First of all, I invite you to look at the bigger picture. And what I propose to talk about is more the end of an era and how the end of an era is affecting the world, and more particularly our two continents. It is, I believe, we've been living through the end of an era for quite some time. It's a dying era, but takes a long time to die. Most of us would agree as to what the key features of the era that we're living behind looked like, but we certainly cannot agree, and most of us cannot even predict what the new era will look like. And what we do know is that we are in an intermediate phase, and Antonio Gramsci, an Italian political philosopher, told us a few decades back that the intermediate periods between two eras are periods when monsters come out, political, economic, and other kinds of monsters. So in that context, first of all, what did the dying era look like? It seems to me that the dying era that lasted for approximately 30 years, and is not completely dead, had at least three key features. One was undisputed US hegemony after the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, two things which were overlapping but not the same. The second was globalization in its liberal, or if you prefer, neoliberal economic version. And the third was the incorporation of communist China into the global capitalist system. I believe these are the three key features of the period between 1990 and changing, but until now. And all these things were also happening against the background of society, economy, and life-changing technological revolutions that are completely transforming our economies, our societies, and the way we live. And of course, what Stephany has already talked about, namely the existential threat to humankind, which is called climate change. So we had an era with three key features and the background of technological revolution and climate change. Now, what has already changed? What has already changed is, first of all, major geopolitical shifts have been taking place in recent years. The US is no longer the undisputed hegemon, but it's most likely to remain for quite some time more equal than anybody else in economic, military, and other terms. But it is a world where there is an emerging superpower, China, but not only an emerging superpower, there are emerging other powers in a world that is becoming increasingly multipolar, but not multilateral. That is very important. And there is dispersion of power, but there are fewer and fewer rules. And in such a world where there's dispersion of power, there is also a growing tendency of might being transformed into right. So the strongest take what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This is the same from Thucydides, talking about the Peloponnesian War about 25 centuries ago. Okay? Now, so we are facing a world in which there is growing dispersion of power, where the country that is more powerful than anybody else is also more equal than it has been for almost a century, more divided, more polarized, and also less interested in playing the role of the world policeman. And that's obviously the United States. And so Mr. Trump is not the one who has changed completely the world, but I believe Mr. Trump, a re-elected Trump, is the one who is in the process of putting the tombstone to the old era, an old era that is already on its dying bed. Now, of course, we have also major changes in terms of economic globalization. Our global supply chains are changing. We don't know yet how far the unwinding of global supply chains will go. But what we do know is there are fewer and fewer rules. There is rising protectionism. There is rising unilateralism. And there is something else which is also very important. And this is the return of the state in the capitalist world. And the return of the state is for both economic and military reasons. It is for economic reasons, protectionism, industrial policy, climate change, but also for military reasons, because in the world we're living through today, economic security takes over from security takes over from economic rationality, more and more. And in that context, the state becomes much more important. And finally, we are having in times where technological revolutions are not only there, but they are accelerating. And the effects of climate change are becoming more glaring than they have ever been before. So this is a world, and Stephany mentioned it, of rapid change, but also great uncertainty. And this great uncertainty is felt very strongly by large sections of our societies who feel they are threatened by change, and who also feel that their domestic democratic political systems are not taking care of them. So they're left unprotected. So it is a world of geopolitical shifts, of technological revolutions, of partial unwinding of economic globalization, but it's also a time when there are shifts within our own societies that are becoming more unequal and more afraid. So I think that in such times, I mean, the way I would describe them in very simple terms is like navigating in rough seas when the weather is changing rapidly and we have a broken compass. And in such times, many people are looking not only for a captain, but a savior. And saviors can often be crooks. There can be different configurations of populists, demagogues, or whatever. So our societies are experiencing the change as well in a very dramatic way. And not to take too much of your time, let me end up with a few words, particularly about Europe and the European Union. Now, it seems to me, first of all, that the good news about the European Union is that it has been remarkably resilient. That in times of never-ending crisis, the EU is not only there, but it is stronger than it used to be 15 years ago and doing more things than it used to do. Give you an example. When Mr. Trump was first elected in 2016, his collaborators were phoning Brussels. Remember, Trump came to power a few months after Brexit, the Brexit referendum. And the Trump associates were phoning Brussels asking who's next, who is following the UK, because Trump and his group were absolutely convinced that this was going to be the end of the European Union, that other countries would follow the UK. Remember that the biggest advisor of Mr. Trump as far as the European Union is concerned is Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the Reform Party in the UK and the greatest demagogue of the lot in the UK. Now, the EU has survived. This is the good news. The bad news is that it is faced with a kind of challenges that require nothing less than a transformation of its DNA. And as I'm sure you all know, changing your DNA is not easy. Let me give you two examples of what I mean by a new world that is asking the EU to change its DNA in order to survive. Two examples are as follows. First of all, European integration has been all along started like this and continued for decades as a peace project. It was a project to establish peace and reconciliation within Europe. So in that respect, European integration was largely inward-looking. It was to deal with intra-European affairs, to deal with a continent that had this bad habit of fighting wars against each other after 20 or 30 years. Right? Now, what we are asking this peace project is to add a defense dimension. And this is new, because Europeans had delegated the responsibility for their defense to NATO, and more particularly the United States. And now Europeans are being called upon to develop European defense cooperation and European defense strategic autonomy. And that is easier said than done. That's the first example. The second example is that European bureaucrats in Brussels had their mindset was about growing liberalization within the European Union and freer trade with the rest of the world. Remember, European economies are very open. Europe has one of the highest, I mean, if you take it as a bloc, Europe is very open to the rest of the world. if you take exports and imports as a percentage of GDP, for the EU, it's almost double that of the United States. Okay, that gives you an idea of the kind of trade openness of European countries. Now, those Europeans, therefore, who were trained to think of freer trade and more liberalization are now being called upon to talk and practice industrial policy and they respond to mercantilism and unilateralism from the United States. And that is, again, a very difficult adaptation that they are being invited to do. And all this is happening at a time when European societies and European political systems are more fragmented than they have been for decades. So, and if there is a difficulty of governability at the national level, this difficulty of governability is multiplied at the European level. So, to put it simply and bluntly, in Europe, most of us agree what we need to do. What we can't see is how the hell we're going to do it. So this is the kind of challenge that we're faced with. And my last word is the book I wrote 2.5 years ago. I was saying that if Putin does not succeed in uniting Europe, perhaps a re-elected Trump may do so. And that was written 2.5 years ago. So I think in that respect, it was prophetic. Now, my last word would be, if Putin and Trump together do not succeed in uniting Europeans, nothing ever will. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very, very much for your reflections. Now, I think we can open the floor to, I don't know, Andrea, if you can have questions for the YouTube audience, or let's before open to the colleagues who are here.
I think our staff is transferring the questions from YouTube to us. So perhaps if I could make one question in the meantime, or perhaps we can open to those here, the authors who are here in the Zoom. If you have some further comments or questions, I have myself one, but I give the floor before to those here. I can see Christian, Stefan, some other colleagues who participated, Tiziano also in the book. So if you want to, Bettina is also there, if you want to raise your hand, so we just have an order. Well, in the meantime, since hands are not raised, maybe I just then bring my brief comment already, which is very much related to this last also point made by Tsoukalis about those requirements for the EU to reorder. And as you were speaking, I must admit, I have to think that, wow, the EU looks more like Latin America in the sense that to face those kinds of structural dilemmas and how to deal with the question of industrial policy and mercantilism that so very often Latin American countries or Latin America, and even in the CEPAL, the industrial policy has been very important for Latin American regionalism, and in a way that has been very much often also criticized from even the EU or in other moments in time, because obviously, I mean, that's probably related to the position where you are into this whole structural capitalist system. And making reference to Stefan, of course, it's a blessed to have those commodities, but if the resources from those commodities are not very well used, and we learn from that in history, they can also lead not to really equal equity and democracy. So the question is also just to put back this concern that in a way, maybe it's a sign of an incentive for more cooperation, because I think maybe some of those challenges are long challenges for Latin America. But just a point about the war, because I think being in Latin America and Brazil, very much often I hear that from colleagues and in our discussions in Brazil, for instance, the war seems very different. I mean, the Ukrainian war, as it was the Yugoslavian war. And here, I think I would argue that it's a different context, and I myself very concerned with how the results of those of that war can bring bigger changes in the absence of the US, not unlike before. So I just put one more question here. I'm not answering to you all, because I know that it's easy to talk about cooperation between the EU and Latin America in economics, development, even all other topics, climate change, but regarding the war and this issue, there's still a lot of dissonance between the interpretations. So I just put that to the floor also for us to think more about. Thank you very much for both excellent comments. An incentive to continue working for all of us in the.
If I may very quickly respond, can I?
Sure.
If I may very quickly to what you just said. Recent developments have made Europeans more aware than they've ever been before that individual European countries count very little in international negotiations. Even the Germans and the French realize that very clearly today. That's the first point. The second point is that faced with a world which is maybe becoming more multipolar, but hugely asymmetrical, right? The Germans on their own cannot negotiate with the United States, nor can they negotiate with China, nor can they negotiate with Apple or Google, okay, on their own. At the same time, what is becoming clearer for Europeans is that they need to diversify their foreign policy. They have to look for partners who may think similarly in other parts of the world. And clearly, Latin America is one of the most obvious examples. And there is already talk in Brussels and elsewhere that European attention has to stop being focused just on the US and China, but you have to prepare yourself for a more multipolar world in which Latin America, Brazil in particular, whoever has a much bigger role to play. Africa for the Europeans is very important, and parts of Asia. So it's going to be a much more diversified foreign policy. And that gives an opportunity for European and Latin American countries to get closer together.
Can I briefly add something? I very much agree with what Loukas has said, and I think it's very important for Latin America to respond in an agile way to this new perception within Europe and to benefit from it. I just wanted to react a little bit to what Andrea said, another important point she made about that these new commodities should lead to a more integrated development, to move up the value chain, as we say. And I think if one looks, for example, at Brazil, I think Brazil is, because of the scale, because its commitment to industrial policy, seems to be doing very interesting things, for example, in the production of lithium batteries and in the production of electric buses and so on. And the Development Bank, BNDES, is playing an important role in helping fund that. And I think at least 2 factories of lithium, which is exactly lithium batteries. And one could also think about increased Latin American integration in the sense of countries like Chile or Bolivia or Argentina have a lot of lithium, exporting not just to China, not just to Europe, but exporting precisely to Brazil, then buying maybe these electric buses from Brazil, not just from China, as we do currently. And so having a process not just of greater industrialization of these resources, but also having it at a regional level, which is, of course, one of the big lessons from the EU and one of the big lessons of the Asian miracle, which was they didn't have these institutions so much like Europe, but they, in practice, integrated their production activities very dynamically. And now it's even useful because now a lot of the exports from China, I just looked at the latest figures, are going to Vietnam and to Thailand and from there to the US. But they can do that because they have these integrated value chains. So I think, but it is, of course, difficult. One of the problems, for example, that we have in Chile is that the government is very restricted, even though you have a government that is from the center left and wants to do more industrial policy, wants to do more public investment, but they don't have the fiscal space. They don't have the fiscal space because first there was a lot of inflation from the COVID times and from an irresponsible previous government. They are not able to increase direct taxation because they don't have a majority and the right blocks it. And so, there are these massive opportunities, but it's very difficult to do things. And that's why external resources become very important. For example, the contribution that the EU can make, the multilateral banks, development banks can make, are very important. So we're but I think the challenge that Andrea poses, that hopefully these new resources or the continuation of existing resources like copper will lead to a more value add, moving up the value chain and a more inclusive development than in previous phases.
Thank you, Gloria. So we have something in the chat here. Oh, yeah, no, it's fine. That was Stephany. So our colleagues here.
I think Stefan is
Stefan?
raising his hand.
May I ask a question to both speakers? Those transition periods Antonio Gramsci spoke about, namely periods where the old order does not work anymore and the new order is not yet found. Those transition periods are very often characterized by two changes. First, a change in the economic paradigm, and second, change in the global hegemony, both on the level of economics as well as on the political level. So the 30s, when Gramsci made his remarks, were a typical example for this transition period where the monsters come up, because what we saw afterwards was the change from neoclassical economics to Keynesian economics, which lasted at least for, I would say, 30 years. And on the level of the global hegemony, the United States become, after the Second World War, the hegemon. Now, in the present transition period, there are two possibilities, and this was already mentioned by both speakers, and particularly by Loukas. There's the possibility of a transition towards a multipolar world, but there's also the possibility that we will see an increasing struggle between China, the challenger, and the United States, at least over the hegemony on the field of the global economy. In my personal judgment, I think that China has already won this struggle on the field of economics. The problem is that on the military field, the situation is very different. But I would like to know what is the position, the judgment of both speakers to these issues. Also concerning, by the way, the issue of economic paradigm, because it becomes increasingly clear that the neoliberal paradigm leads to nowhere, but I do not see any kind of concrete alternative.
Who wants to start?
Shall I say one word very quickly? Indeed, I've talked about three main changes in this intermediate period. One is, as you pointed out, the geopolitical tectonic shifts. And we're not sure. I don't know whether this is going to be a period where we end up with a multipolar world, or we end up with a growing struggle, competition, rivalry between the United States and China, a Cold War that could always risk becoming warm or hot, okay, which is always a possibility. That's the one factor. The second is, clearly, I talked about the return of the state in the economy, but not only in the economy, for defense. Now, of course, the return of the state, if you take Latin America, also very much Europe, the return of the state in many ways requires an increase in revenues for the state, because the state in a typical European country in the EU is called upon to invest in technology, to pay for defense, to pay more for social cohesion, and also to pay for green transition. And the key question is, where will the money come from? Because we have not provided an answer to that question. We know what we need, but we haven't agreed. I mean, most politicians in Europe will talk about lowering taxation instead of increasing taxation. So, and similar to Latin America, there is not that amount of fiscal space for European countries to borrow massively. So where will the money come from? And then I mentioned the third feature of this intermediate phase, and this is our societies. So the shifts are also internal. And what the shift in many countries is towards more strongmen, more authoritarian rulers, and more populists. How do you marry the three? The geopolitical shift, the return of the state, and the more authoritarian ruler, and the shift to the right, is not an obvious answer. There's no obvious answer to that. And that's why I don't think we know what the new era will look like, and the intermediate phase may last long.
Can I just compliment briefly? I think this is a very good question. I mean, for, say, Latin American governments, it's a very difficult situation because, for example, I think Chile and I believe also Brazil, their main trading partners is China. At the same time, our financial links are mainly with the US and the US dollar. And so in a way, and I think during the first Trump administration, there was some pressure for the Latin American countries to choose. You have to choose, you're either with us or you're against us. And they define being against us as being more with China. And so it's difficult because a country like Chile, or Brazil, or Peru wants to have links with both, but to the extent that the rivalry accentuates, like Loukas was saying, countries may be forced to choose between the two, which would be very bad for Latin American countries. So I think it was different, for example, under Obama, under Biden. I think there was a deeper understanding that Latin America needed both. Of course, there was a preference with strengthening the links. But one of the things that is interesting in this, we had a meeting actually with Janet Yellen when she was Treasury Secretary. And we told her, I mean, she was very diplomatic, but she obviously showed a sort of implicit preference that we didn't have so much Chinese investment or trade so much with China. She understood it. Huh? She was very, very gentle. But what we told her was, we're very happy to have more American investment, but we don't get it. And I've heard the Africans say the same to the Europeans. who complain that there's too much Chinese presence on the African continent. And they say, no, no, we would love to have more German and French investment. But you know, you don't give us as much. The Chinese are there, maybe they're not so good, maybe the roads they build or the ports they help us build are not so well done as a German would do it. But, you know, it's what we have. So there's also a call for these powers, if they want to relate with these poorer parts of the world as partners, to not just put it in a negative sense, although I understand they're competing, but also in a positive sense. Okay, I want more presence in Latin America or Africa. So then I'm going to invest more, I'm going to trade more, and so on. And this is not so clear. It's all a bit on the negative side.
I think Christian has raised his hand. Please.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Andrea, and thanks for the colleague and speakers. I would like to be back a little bit on the focus of this book, at least what we tried to do with the title. It was to focus on the permacrisis aspect. That means that we are trapped in a situation where the solution for any crisis is blocked by other crises. And from one crisis, we are getting into another one. So this is a negative observation we could do in the present situation. But I would like to make the following observation, is that for the same reason that we are trapped into something like a vicious circle from one crisis to another one, there is also the possibility to reverse this cycle and to make from the perma-crisis to make a perma-exit crisis process, because the most important for me are the link between the different crises. And what I try to do in my 2 chapters in this book, and especially starting from the second one, which is an attempt to put some figure on the macroeconomic aspect of what decarbonization would require systemically and macroeconomically. And it's really, how to say that, it's a shock when we consider the resources we need for, in reality, for saving humankind in 2 or 3 decades. It's not for 1 century ago, it's for 2 or 3 decades from now that the process of global warming will become a real threat for human life and human society, at least in the whole earth. And economists, as far as I see, are not enough working on this aspect because the function of an economist is to put focus on the fight against scarcity. And the major threat for the welfare, so the increase in scarcity, is the global warming, because it's a real systemic aspect which will affect absolutely all the aspects of the life in society. So I give an example. To solve the global warming crisis, we need, for example, to solve the problem of the international monetary system and the Triffin dilemma, which is one of my specialty, of course, but you could realize now, let's take the example of the Trump policy. Trump policy are starting from the Triffin dilemma. As the chief economist of the White House has made explicit, he starts from the Triffin dilemma for making us to pay for the cost that the US are suffering from the Triffin dilemma, of course, forgetting that the genuine solution is to eradicate the dilemma and not to to make us to pay, or the rest of the world to pay for some inconvenience of their exorbitant privilege aspect or monetary aspect, affecting the rest of all the issue of the global warming. Because indeed, with the Triffin dilemma in the present dollar system, it is impossible to finance decarbonization in the South, in emerging country and less developing country, because the US are absorbing too much of the net saving of the world. So let's give some example of the shock that decarbonization could mean. Up to 2050, we should each year to increase our investment in alternative energy of something about 2.5 of the GDP in the advanced economy and 5% of GDP for all the emerging and less developing countries. That means for the planet that we need to cut consumption by a significant percentage each year during several decades. Without that, humanity will die in 3 or 4 decades. What economists are doing for facing such an issue, they are talking mostly in the major issue any economist should be attached to present his reflection, his suggestion, his solution, or at least to discuss how do we proceed. Because for solving such a problem, there is no way without multilateral cooperation, no way without changing the international monetary system based unfairly on the currency of a single economy, which is unable to provide a stable liquidity for the world. And there is no solution if we don't resolve the excessive yield in financial area with respect to the real area where we should invest, not so much in finance, but in real investment, especially in the fight against global warming. Well, these things are what economists should do as a first priority in the whole world, because no country could save itself from global warming. No, even big I wanted to focus on in this project, and with a development especially on the CBDC, so the central bank digital currency, which could be a way to accelerate the transition of the international monetary system, but precisely Trump's policy are blocking this possibility because Mr. Trump prohibits the Federal Reserve to continue to prepare an e-dollar because he wants to propose a dollar stable coin for himself with a commission is projecting to privatize the dollar for him.
Yeah, dear Chrissa,
solving some aspect of the US budgetary deficit.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very, very much. But we are short of time. Some of our colleagues, most of us have to excuse me to interrupt you. But we need to close our webinar. Thank you so much. And with that, on behalf of the 3 of us, and the whole group, the Jean Monnet Project, we would like to close this discussion and to thank you very much for the whole ideas and the many insights that you brought. And maybe that the last word would be that we could think again, of the importance of democracy and the values of human rights, especially in the coming elections that we will have in Brazil and in other countries. And we would love to invite you all to have another discussion as soon as everyone can. I'm very happy to see Bettina, Stefan, Christian, Stephany here again. And thank you again for being with us this morning here or afternoon there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you also on behalf of not the Jamone and PUC-Rio, and see you all soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.